All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about today, of course it did. Oh, let's break that out so I can go back and forth. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the exam that we just had, exam 2. I only had about 2 students who didn't take it, one of them which has never done anything in the course, so I'm assuming that they're just not really taking the course, but they didn't bother to drop, which I'll contact them about. If you look, this is the score and the standard deviation. So I gave you 50 minutes, so right, the average time is about 37.5, but we want to take into account that some people took it in like 6, 10, 20 minutes, right? So very, very quickly. So they're putting a lot of influence. And then we only have one person that scored a 98%. So if you look, or 1 or 2 people. So if you look, the average right in the center, and I know the live stream can't see this, right? But I will talk about the actual questions in a second, so that way you guys can take notes. But one of the things about this exam is the exam 2 is always the hardest exam, right? Intentionally, it's the hardest exam. Well, let me check because. Okay. So exam 2 is always the hardest exam. Exam 1, I want you to get used to the format, right? It's a short format, 50 minutes open note, right? I want you to adjust that format. Exam 2, right, is I am adjusting. This is too low. Oh, I hate this thing. Okay. Exam 2 is all about, right, getting you to the hardest point, right? The other 2 exams should actually be a little easier because 1, right, I made this exam harder intentionally, and 2, a lot of this material is going to repeat. We'll see this happen, right? Gerrymandering is going to come up multiple times, right? The process of redistricting is going to come up, especially this year, because we're doing a census right now, right? We're doing a census. We're going to say how many people are in each state. Because that many people are in each state, right, we're going to change the number of people, representatives in some states, and that's going to cause a lot of redistricting, right, in the next cycle, right? In 2021, what we'll see, right, in next year's session after the election, the House of Representatives and state houses in each state, right, in Nevada, they're going to be redrawing districts. So, right, some of this is going to keep coming up. That's going to keep coming up. We're going to discuss that more. The average score is 72%. University sort of, the university department kind of want an 85% standard, right? That even though I don't like that, right? I like an 80%, right? Because they want an 85% because of the discrimination index, right? And I'll show for those of you in class, and then I'll discuss this, right? Some of the questions, a lot of people gave different answers. And when I have a lot of people give different answers, that usually means I didn't make it as clear as I possibly could. Or when I was discussing it, I gave some indications. So one of the questions, see if I can just search for this. Really? Fine. All right. So one of the questions is that so the first thing is I'm gonna adjust the grade, right? The first thing is it's 75% is about a 15. I want about a 16. So I'm gonna add a point to everyone's exam. So for those who are like, okay, there were some questions that I'm sure, why did I get them wrong, right? I'm gonna add a point. So that's a whole percentage point. That's gonna help you out a little bit because I wanted the test to be hard, but not that hard, right? The other part is some of these questions have very nuanced responses, intentionally very nuanced responses, right? So I discussed this part. I discussed that it wasn't just 10% of the state, it was 10% in each district. So if you're reading through the text, right, it's going to talk about this. This is why I paid particular attention to this question, right? If you're trying to get an initiative on the ballot, for those of you who can't see, we're doing the live stream, right? You need 10% in each district. You can't just get 15, 20% of, right, Las Vegas, and you'll do this. I think I asked this question or I discussed this before, right, in the last lecture. So when you're going through, remember that I'm giving you the answers for the harder questions. The easier questions I don't spend as much time on, but when I know it's a harder question, I'm going to give you the answer. The other one, which a lot of people were discussing, is this idea of a cognitive shortcut. So we discussed this, right? I intentionally spent time on this because when we're talking about skim and scan, right, that's when they're processing information, right? I'm going to take a little bit here and there. I'm going to go through it quickly. What I was discussing is this mental capacity, right, where you say, I'm going to vote for Republicans. I'm going to vote for Democrats. And choosing party ID is not taking limited information. That's taking one cue, right, and making your decision based off that one cue because you believe that cue is connected to other things. And we call that a cognitive shortcut, right? So I discussed this last time. I want to discuss it. But obviously, right, we had more respondents get this question wrong than get it right, right? That usually means, right, that usually means there's some issue with that question. Right, I always want to see if I have a question, I want to see the majority of people get it right, and then sort of a dispersion of answers everywhere else, right? My class should not be that hard that few people get the right answer. All right, are there any questions about exam 2 or future exams right now? And I know I'm talking to the live stream. I've got some of you, okay. Okay, yeah, so I am not currently talking about the slides, right? I am reviewing exam 2. So when I'm discussing to the live stream, I can't actually put this up because you can't share screens in YouTube, but I'm talking about exam 2. So this is not part of that. So to answer the question on the live stream, we're going to be discussing We the People chapter 9 today. So those are the slides you should be on. But what I'm discussing right now is the exam 2 and why some of the nuanced questions are a little off. So we're sort of hitting two audiences, so I apologize if that's confusing to some people. All right. So those are some questions. Are there any questions specifically about exam 2? All right, remember, my number 4 is not your number 4. All right, so okay, so the question was, let me go back to, okay. So the question for those of you in the live stream was about one of the questions on the exam, right? And it's that what term refers to a basic principle that shapes a person's opinion about political beliefs, right? And the answer is values, okay? And so attitude means something else, right? It's about a specific policy or, right, or preference, right? Socialization is a process, right? Socialization is the process by which you get values, right? So your parents have values, they socialize you to those values. So socialization is not the same, it's the process, it's the mechanism. So we know that it's not socialization, we know it's not attitude because that's about a particular preference, it's not about sort of a principle, right? And then when we talk about a basic principle, right, political ideology is not a basic principle. You have your values and then your values align with a political ideology. But the order in which it happens, right, the value is a basic principle. So I see a lot of people got political ideology on this one. Basic principle that shapes a person's opinion about political issues, that section of it is actually from the text, the actual words from the text. That's how I know that this is the right answer for that question. Because if you were to go through, if you have an essentials edition, it's the key terms in the back of the chapter. If you have one of the larger books, it's on the margin, right? But it will actually say values, colon, and then those exact words. So some of these questions, it's because I can make them a little harder because if it's open notebooks, you're like, oh, I'm not sure. You can actually go through your text, find those words, and it'll give you specific definitions. So hopefully that clears it up, and hopefully the live stream can follow along as well. I know that you can't see the screen, and I apologize for that. All right, are there any more questions about exam 2 that you would like me to cover? I apologize. I think this mask is a little thicker, so if I'm not as clear, just let me know. This one's made out of like felt, so I think it's affecting my speech. All right, so if there are no exams, if there are no questions about exam 2, let me talk a little bit about the rest of the semester. If you are doing well in the semester, right, a lot of you have a pretty good grade. I dropped the lowest exam, and the final is counted as an exam. So that's part 1, right, that I dropped the lowest exam. If you do well on 3 exams, if you get an A on the first 3 exams or well enough to sort of average into an A on the first 3 exams, you have an A for exams because I'm going to drop the lowest exam, exam 4. That's 60% of your grade, right? 20% of your grade, right? So we're up to 80%, right? Is the paper. 20% of your grade is the paper. You can turn the paper in early. The paper prompt is up, right? If you go to the main page, there's a paper prompt. It tells you the 3 articles I want you to use. They're short. I picked them because they're short. They're actually not very good articles. They're not empirically the best articles about this issue. They're very short. I think they're like 10 pages or less, right? So I'm not asking you to read a ton about this. Turn in a paper early. 2 things happen when you turn in a paper early. I give you 2 points extra credit. So that's 10% higher. right? It's out of 20, I give you 10 points. So if you write me a B paper and you turn it in early, it becomes an A paper, right? So that's automatic, right? Extra credit early. If you turn it in at least 2 weeks before the due date, I will grade it, send you comments, give it back to you, and you can resubmit, right? That's always been my policy. If you're worried, you're like, I have English as a second language, or my writing skills have always been really bad, or that's not something that I know how to focus on, or I have no idea what you mean by, right, peer-reviewed sources or citation, I don't know any of this stuff, write something out so I can see what you've done, and then I will give you all that you need to get to the grade. And I won't just say, here's what you need to do better. I will say, here's what you need to get an A on this paper. I'm very explicit when it comes to that stuff, right? So when it comes to that, right, write the paper early, do well in exam 3, that's 80% of your grade. The assignments will be in by November 5th. We will have enough assignments posted that you could be done, right? And I have always said this, and no one has ever fought me on this. If this is a political science 101 course, this is a humanities course, I'm supposed to be teaching you critical thinking. One of the things is about time management, right? Workload management. If you are taking anatomy and calculus, right, and physics, and this is something that was forced upon you, do really well, put in the effort, do the first 3 exams, get through this, right? So at the end of the semester, you can refocus on other courses. I've never hid that, right? You were forced to be here. I want to give you the opportunity during finals week to focus on the things that you really are focused on as your major. But I need enough information from you that I can justify saying, okay, you've got enough material from this. And at the end of the semester, right, what I want is for those of you who are getting an A, say, okay, I worked really hard, I got my A, right? Because the A students give me a lot of questions and emails during the semester. So what I want to do is get you to a position where you feel comfortable you have an A. And then you can engage in the material. What do you want to learn, right? What is important to you? Or do you want to focus on their classes? And then those A students, those 10, 12 A students, they're going to get below a C- in my class, right? And so the idea is between November 5th and December 13th, when we go into finals week, I'm going to come back and I'm going to get students. So if you got a thing that said you're not doing as well in the course, that's not me telling you you're failing. Everyone can still get a very good grade in this class. That's me communicating to you that I want you to get involved, and I'm going to give you the steps to succeed, right? And the paper is the easiest part. I have never failed a student who turned in a paper, ever. If you turn in a paper, the likelihood that you fail my class goes to almost 0, right? Now, if you only turn in a paper and you don't do any of the other stuff, then you still fail. But everyone who's turned in a paper, in the experience that I've had, and this is like my 10th time teaching this, right? Out of 400 students, right, no one has failed to turn in a paper. So make sure you don't forget that. It is still 20% of your grade. All right, so that's the review of the class. If we finish chapter 9, we are going to go into chapter 10 because I had a question early in the semester talking about this current election. And I am nonpartisan, right? I will never tell you who to vote for. I'm only going to tell you to vote, right? Remember the last day. In assignment 5, there's a question about the last day to register to vote online. It is October 29th, right? 10/29. That's the last day to register to vote online in Nevada, right? So if you want to vote, make sure you go before the 29th and register. And it's a question on assignment 5, which is due this Thursday, right? So it's posted, it's due. You should be able to see it, right? Make sure you get through it. That means there's only 5 assignments left in the course, right? So I want to cover 9 and 10, and then on Thursday, what I would like to do is I would like to talk to you about the election, right? I have a sample ballot that I got, and the actual initiatives, right, which is an important thing for Nevada, and it's a thing that we're going to get tested on more than once. The actual initiatives are worded very poorly, right, and not intentionally difficult to read, right? If you look at one, it sort of makes sure that you don't have discrimination against same-sex partners in the law, but it also provides churches and other services the right to refuse service on same-sex marriages, right? That's part of the same initiative that's coming up in your election, right, in less than a month, right? So I want to discuss what does that mean? And what I'm going to try and do, which is why I've typically avoided this, I'm going to try to not include any sort of stigmatized values, beliefs, morality, anything. I'm going to tell you exactly what it does. Right now, obviously, you can tell that my biases leak through a little, right? Because I'm saying, oh, great, you have the end of legal discrimination in same-sex marriage, but you also have refusal, right? Depending on what side you're on, you might see some bias in my language, right? But what I want to do is provide you with enough information that you know what you want to do, right? Without persuading you. And that's going to be difficult for me, but right, the intention is there to say, here are all the people. Now, I'm not going to discuss the presidency or, right, I'm not going to discuss who's running for president. I think you have a very clear choice there, one way or the other, like no judgment values, anything like that. What I am going to discuss is the initiatives and some of the judges and, right, who means what, right? And what does it mean to have a retention election, right? And we saw, right, which we talked about before, that in the ballot, there's a none of these candidates, right? Now, one of them, right, there's just an option to reelect that judge or none of these candidates, which means that that judge is going to get reelected, right? He's the only one on the, he or she is the only one on the ballot, right? So no matter how many people say none of these, you're still going to have that judge win, right? But they still have to have a vote, right? There's just no one running against them, right? They're running unopposed. So on Thursday, that's what I would like to do is get through the ballot, discuss it, right? I'm going to actually bring the sample ballot and sort of like hold it up to the screen so we can sort of look at it. I'm going to see if I can do better with this camera than I have in the past so we can get clear images, or I might photocopy it and sort of just put the PDFs online so everyone has access to it, right? But I'd like you to be more informed about that, and I had someone specifically ask me, so I want to provide that opportunity. Okay. Oh, the other thing is there's only 5 people in the classroom right now. There's nothing wrong with that because you have an option to view online. If you want to be in the classroom, there's room, right? Don't feel like you're taking up someone else's spot. There's definitely room. But also, right, the president tested positive for COVID. He had a big event here right around the time, right? He had the sort of the Rose Garden event, and you can be sort of non-symptomatic for a time. So if you don't feel comfortable, don't come in, right? If you need to talk to me, I have office hours. If you need to talk to me on one-on-one, we will set up a WebEx or a Skype or whatever you feel comfortable to talk on, right? You don't just have to email me. If you would like to talk face-to-face or virtual face-to-face, right? Make sure you take up that opportunity, right? Everyone's doing okay in the class, but if you want to talk about something or if you want some answers to questions, I am available. And I have to be available by my contract. So don't feel like you're taking up my time. I have to be available to you. Okay, so that is enough of that. Let's open up the slides for political parties. Okay. Hopefully I answered everyone's question. There we go. Okay, so when we're talking about political parties, we want to remember that their goal is different from interest groups. One is they're different from interest groups. Interest groups don't care who gets elected. They want their policy, right? Interest groups care about policy. Political parties organize specifically for a singular goal, to elect their members, right? So when you have a political party, right now we're going to talk about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And we'll talk about third parties at the end of this lecture. Part of that is because third parties don't have as much of a role, and now we'll discuss that at the end of the lecture as well, right? Why are we only going to talk about Republicans and Democrats? So Republicans and Democrats organize into parties for the express purpose of getting elected. If you want to get elected in sort of Eugene, Oregon, you need to be a Democrat. It's a very democratic environment, right? If you want to be elected as a Republican, right, or if you're a conservative and you want to get elected, you need to align with the Republican Party in deep southern states, right? So there's these enclaves that each place has, right, and those parties. The reason that functions so well, right, is one, right, we have sort of an alignment of values, right, but two, right, these parties have good organizational structure. They're good at fundraising. They're good at name recognition, right? There's down ticket voting, right? If Biden gets a lot of young people to vote, those young people are going to vote for other Democrats down ticket, right? They're not just going to vote for the president, they're also going to vote for all the Democrats down that. We'll talk about down ticket voting when we get to split ticket voting. So the next term is partisanship. Partisanship is when an individual like you, right, identifies with a particular party, right? Partisanship is your support for the party, right? You have a party, that's what a party is, and then partisanship is your support for that party. When someone says, I'm a Republican, right, that doesn't mean they're a member of the party. You have to actually go through a process to become a member of the Republican Party. When someone says, I'm a Republican, that means they vote for, campaign for, contribute to or in some other way support the Republican Party, right? Most people are just voters and they call themselves Republicans because they are partisan to that party, right? And so partisanship means something else, right? So because we had a little definitional questions issue, right, I want to be very clear about this. In the United States, we have a two-party system. And one of the reasons we have a two-party system in the United States is that when we have an election, there's one winner. And this used to be a very sort of clear rule that really only applies to the United States as clearly today. But if you have one winner and the winner just needs a plurality of votes, right? In most elections in the United States, you just have to have the most votes, right? But because it's sort of first past the post, this language of first past the post, right? Who gets to the majority of votes first, right? Because if we count all the votes, who has the most votes, right? That the two groups, right, sort of rational logic going together, two groups are going to try and consolidate all the other groups to maximize their vote share, right? The Republicans, I don't know if it mirrors, but right, the Republicans on my right hand, right, and the Democrats on the left, they're actually going to move to the middle, because if they're in the middle, right, everyone to their left is going to be Democratic and everyone to the right is going to be Republican. Because if you're, right, say this is where my thumbs are, is the middle, right? If you're way over here at my index fingers, you're still going to vote for a Democrat because they're still closer than a Republican, right? A moderate Democrat is still more aligned with you if you're a very deep sort of liberal Democrat. They're still more aligned with you than any Republican, right? And so, right, that's how you get a two-party system. The parties move to the middle to absorb anyone on the far left or right. And they, no matter how far towards the middle they come, as long as they don't cross over to the other side, right, everyone on the left will vote Democrat and everyone on the right will vote Republican. And because we have a lot of alignment between party and values and partisanship, right, you don't have sort of mixed values where you're like, oh, you know, typically, right, there's always exceptions. Typically, if you're pro-life, you're also not, right, sort of other issues, sort of more liberal issues, right? Pro-lifers, conservative, Republican, your issues align, right? Pro-lifers are typically more likely to want to protect gun rights, right? So gun rights and being pro-life and low taxes and social conservatism, those all sort of come in one package now because of the alignment in the United States, right? Whereas if you're pro-choice, you're more likely to be sort of for gun reform, you are going to be more likely to be, right, for increased taxes if it means increased services, right? No one's truly for increased taxes, but increased services which require increased taxes. Okay. This mask is felt and it is not comfortable. So we go through a process. The parties have some control because of this process of a primary election. Before you go to an election, if you're part of any party, you go through a primary election. And the primary election is not run by the government, right? The government does not run the primary elections. The parties run the primary elections, which means they set the rules for the primary elections. They set up the debate structure for the primary elections, and they set up other aspects of the primary election, right? So the first part is nomination. The parties, right, have to select a candidate for one office, right? And they need to nominate someone, right? So the Republican nominee for the presidential election is Donald Trump, right? And the current president, Donald Trump, right? And for the Democratic Party, their nominee, right, is Joe Biden, right? And so they have nominated them. But why do they nominate them? In part because of primary elections. Excuse me, this thing is all over the place. Okay. Oh. So you can have a primary in two different ways, right? We'll talk about this difference between a primary election and a caucus. A primary election is very simple. All Republicans, right, or if it's open primary, everyone who shows up, they vote to pick their candidate among Republicans. So in 2016, Donald Trump was a Republican, identified as a Republican, was a Republican partisan, right, in that primary against 16 other people, right? All of those people were trying to get the nomination for the Republican Party. In a caucus, it's a little more constrained because it's also a little more chaotic. In a caucus, right, in a primary election, you vote. The people vote, right? You have a very large vote. In the same way that you would have a general election, they vote, right? In a caucus, what happens is that you have the candidate or some representative of the candidate stand in one corner of the room, right? If there are four of us, right, each corner would be a camp for a specific potential candidate. And you would go and stand with your candidate. Usually why this is like a closed system, because just the people in the room sort of come in. Or, right, the Democrats used to do this where other elected officials, the state house, would pick their candidate, right? If you were part of the Democratic elected officials, right, if you were a representative in the state of California, you would pick, right, your nominee for that state, right? And caucuses are sort of shrinking because people want a vote in everything. So you meet up and we set up in the four corners and there's four of us and I end up getting 3 people and all of the other groups get less than the majority, right? They all say they all get 10, right? Well, what they're gonna do is they're gonna say, okay, obviously I'm not gonna win. So my 3 people have to go and communicate with the other camps to see what their second choice is. And then they're gonna go to their second choice. And then what's gonna happen is until you only have 2 choices and you know which one is the better of 2 choices, you'll keep breaking out the other groups, right? And pulling those people into your camp. Right? So if say I only have 3 votes and there's still 3 candidates left and still no more clear majority, then the person with the least amount of votes after I was eliminated, their people would go and try and pick among the best candidate. So this is what happens in a caucus, is why it forms a little better, right? It's sort of like a runoff, right? No one got majority, right? If you go in and there's 40 votes and all 40 people go stand by one candidate, it's over. But if they're broken out, there's no clear majority, you keep reducing the number of candidates until you have one person that has a clear majority, and they become the nominee in a caucus. So parties, right, are organized, right, to get people elected. So they have a formal structure. And this formal structure, one has leaders, right? You have the leader of the DNC and the DCCC, right? The 2 parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party. The 2 parties, right, have leaders. And those leaders determine funding, right? They help with fundraising, right? If you're the Republican, right? If you're the Republican nominee in Kansas, but the Republican Party nationally doesn't like you, then they're not going to fund your campaign. Right, if they don't think you're going to win, right? Sometimes Republicans are just in seats where they're highly unlikely to win, right? Right now, Dan Rotheimer and Susie Lee are running maybe in your district, because the districts in Las Vegas are broken up a little bit. But right now, you've probably seen a lot of ads for Dan Rotheimer or Susie Lee, right, between the 2, right? We know statistically, right, that Dan Rotheimer doesn't have that great of a chance of winning. Not just because of the campaigns, but because he's a Republican. Right? By nature of being Republican in this district, when there are more Democrats that might vote, right, the likelihood that Dan Rotheimer wins. So the party might say, the leadership of the party might decide not to fund Dan Rotheimer as much, right? I don't actually know the dollar amounts that they're being funded. The other part is they have election committees, right? A lot of times the party will come together in these committees and they'll say, are these candidates viable, right? Can these candidates win the election? And what the party's trying to do is find candidates that are still Republican, but not so sort of far to the right that they can't win in a general election, right? Remember, the goal of a party is to win an election. So if your goal is to win an election, you do want Republican candidates, but you want them to be a little more moderate so they have an opportunity to win. Okay. Hold on. I apologize. Okay. I knew this was going to happen. Sorry, just if you're, I know in class is confusing, but if you're on the live stream, just try and ignore when stuff like that happens. It's one of the costs of being able to live stream. Did I just lose my place? I probably did. Okay, so these election committees are trying to determine viability, right? So you want someone who's moderate, but not too moderate, but also not too Republican, so they have a chance to win. And election committees do that. Also, election committees, what they'll do is they'll do research, right? Not only just the party research opposition, right? You need to know everything that you can, find out everything you can that is bad about the other party, right? But you also need to find out what's bad about your candidate. Right? Right now, there is a Democratic official, right, who's in part of a scandal. That party, right, the Democratic Party really wanted to know that ahead of time, so they didn't back him, right? They spent a lot of money on him to get elected. When you find out something like that, which means he's not likely to win, right, then you might have wanted to use that funding elsewhere, right? And the reason why I'm talking about this is because, remember, parties don't have unlimited funds. They have a lot of money, but so does the other party. So strategic management of your funds is very important. You have active members, right, pundits, delegates, people who work with the party, and then of course paid staff. So once you get near a presidential election, then you have to have a national convention. And a national convention has a very important aspect that isn't just about nominating a candidate. So the Republican National Convention, the RNC and the DNC, right, they both come together before a presidential election, and they do nominate their official candidate for president, but the other part is they adopt party rules and the party platform. So the rules of the party, what are the rules of the party going to be? How do we function this, right? How are we going to operate in the next so many years, right, the next 2 years? The other part is the party platform. And this is what sort of Biden's been talking about, right? That about his platform that exists, right? Now, I'm not trying to say that right or wrong, right? But when you heard him say the platform, the party platform is my platform. When you have a president get nominated, their policies become part of the platform because the delegates at the convention are the people, represent the people who are getting nominated, right? So Biden got the most nominees, right? So his people represent the party at the convention. And therefore the platform represents Biden's policies, right? And the platform, the Republican platform, similarly represents Trump's policies, right? Both presidential candidates, it's just that whenever you have an incumbent, right? When you have an incumbent president, a president who's already serving, there isn't as much, right? You don't go through a primary season because you don't want to mess up things, right? Incumbents are often likely to win. Right? Just by being incumbent, right? Because President Trump is the incumbent, he's currently in office, he also has a slight advantage on winning because typically people vote for people who are already in office, right? If I'm going to vote for someone, right, and I'm just sort of a blank person, right? I don't have other attitudes and values and principles, and I haven't been socialized, I'm usually going to vote for who's already in office because people don't like change as much as we think. I don't know why. Okay. So when you're developing this platform, a platform is a document. It is a written document, right? And I want to be very clear about it. It's a written document that states all of the philosophy, principles, and positions on issues, right? It states that the Democratic Party for Biden, right? It states that they are a pro-life party, right? That they should be funding for Planned Parenthood, that there should be a national intervention when it comes to this pandemic, right? These are things, right? And hopefully I'm not swaying you, none of this should be new information, right? The Democrats want different things than the Republicans. But that platform is a document that spells out all of the issues that are important to that party, right? Because it's the one time that the people who didn't get nominated, their delegates, get to speak about, right, the issues that matter to them, right? This is when the people who are delegates for Sanders and Harris and all of the other candidates, Klobuchar, right, and Mayor Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, right? All of them get a chance to, right, speak to the issues that matter to them, right? And so this platform, this document, right, explains all of the issue positions of that party going forward. So it's this treasure trove of information because if there are any issues that you want to look at, it's going to be in that party platform. And obviously it's important to me, right? I like when there are documents, right? I like that there's something written that we can look at. Right? If you ask what's the Democratic Party's position on any issue, it's going to be in the platform, right? And that gives us information, right? That's not right? As an educator, that's something that educators enjoy, right? Because it's very clear, there's no rhetoric, it's just, well, how are the opinions on the issues at each party? And so a platform is very useful. Okay, so to answer the question on the live stream, has there ever been a candidate that didn't get the nomination for second term? Well, yes. Remember that I want to say Grover Cleveland, but I could be wrong. Grover Cleveland served in 2 non-consecutive terms. He served, and then someone else ran, and then someone else. So the part is that it's possible for the incumbent not to get the nomination, but usually that doesn't happen. Remember that presidents are still human beings. So if they believe that they're not going to get the support of the party, they will choose not to run again. Some presidents in the past have chosen not, right, to run for office again, right? Or they knew they were in a position. But that doesn't happen publicly, right? You would never want that to happen publicly. So have there been presidents who didn't run for a second term or were capable of running for a second term, but then also didn't get the nomination? Sometimes that's unclear because if you know, right, because the president is always in communication with his party, his or her party. So when the president and the party are communicating, if the party is very clear, like, we will not support you in your next campaign, then that president will likely not run for office. And so you miss some of that. It's not as public. And not running for office, I mean, not in the last sort of 100 years has that been as common. I'm only 250 years old, so, but it's quite rare, but it is possible, but I don't have a specific example. Because I don't know if Grover Cleveland didn't win the election or if he wasn't nominated or if he didn't run. It's not as clear. Okay. Why? Okay, if that continues, we will have to switch to a Panopto just because it's closed, or I will use an invitation issue. I apologize. I know that's going to keep happening, right? That it's targeted. So let's try and get back to this, and then we'll see how long that goes. All right. So the next part, right, is that sort of shocking. That we have the party machines. So you have an organized party. So what's the next part, right? Is this party machine, right? And a party machine, right, is part of this process where they start having bosses, right? McCarran being the boss during the political machine during the early 20th century in Nevada, right? In this area. And the problem with political machines is that the bosses, right, sort of this adage or sort of saying in political science, right, this, if you have absolute power, right, you're corrupt absolutely, right? You will be corrupted absolutely, right? Too much power in one person's hands is going to corrupt that individual, right? That's why you have checks and balances in government. That's why we have transparency, right? And so what happens is these party machines, they start running to a point where power in the party gets consolidated to an individual. And then that individual uses their power to pick nominations, right? So if you don't make the boss happy, you can't get nominated by that party. And the other part is that there's an expectation of patronage, right? If you get elected, the party expects you to put their cronies in certain positions, right? Patronage is a big issue because there are only so many positions that need to be filled. And there are no qualifications for a lot of these positions. Remember that the deputy director of the Department of Education has a PhD in education. Well, they have an EDD, a doctorate in education, right? The people at the high level bureaucracy in the State Department, in all departments, but we're going to talk about the Department of Education, they have advanced degrees in that field. They are trained and experienced in that field. If they do not have an advanced degree, they have a lot of training and experience. If you're a high level bureaucrat in any agency, you have to have a great deal of experience and knowledge. If you are not, right, a bureaucrat, but you are appointed to that high level position, you need no knowledge, right? And the way we know this is patronage is because a lot of ambassadors to smaller nations, their one reason for being put in as an ambassadorship is that they raised a lot of money for that campaign, right? I mean, this is not partisan, right? It's not Democrat or Republican. If you raise $1 million for a specific candidate, presidential candidate, and they win, right, it is likely that there will be some reward for you, right? And that is clear patronage. And it's problematic that it's clear patronage, right? But the party machines had so much patronage, right, that it became this level of corruption, right? And patronage doesn't just have to be offices, it can also be grants, licenses, and special favors. Okay. I apologize for those of you in the live stream. I'm not great with this technology, and it's very frustrating. I apologize that you have to see a lot of that, and then I'm gonna have to, crap. I'm really not good with this, so I'm probably gonna have to, so frustrating. All right, hold on. There's no way to close comments. Oh yeah, sorry. I know the live stream is working fine. There's a violation of conduct for it to be open and then the comments that they're making. So I just need to close the comments, and unfortunately you guys won't be able to communicate, but also there won't be as much sort of inappropriate commentary coming in. And I will look into why that's happening in a minute. Man, I really don't know how to fix this. Okay. I don't want to end the live stream, so I will just have to stay on top of it, and then afterwards I will learn how to work this in this the live chat, because it's not. Okay. I apologize. I apologize for the interruptions. So patronage, right, they get licenses, special favors, right, grants, right, and all of this patronage allows the individual to gain from that being the boss of that party machine. And so it also explains why party machines collapse in the 1960s, because that corruption leads to inefficiency, right? One of the things about corruption, right, I don't ever speak to morality. So I would never say corruption is wrong. One of the things about corruption that we can discuss as a political scientist is it's very inefficient, right? Everyone along that corrupt process takes away from that public good. If I want taxpayer money to go towards a road and I have to do kickbacks for everyone along that process, the quality and amount of roads is going to decline. And because of that, right, it's going to be a larger issue where those individuals, right, are getting a payment from taxpayers, but the public itself is not benefiting. So we always want to make sure that we limit corruption because of inefficiencies that it creates. And patronage is one of those things that it's not necessarily corruption, but it can be at an excessive level, right? If I win a presidential election, I want to choose who's in charge of the State Department, the Department of Education, right? I want to choose those people. And I may not want someone who's an expert. I might want someone who's loyal, right? We see this a lot with presidents, not just President Trump, but presidents in the past. I want someone who's loyal. Because a department chair or a secretary, right, a secretary of state, secretary of the Department of Education, right, those secretaries, I want them to be doing what I want as president, not what necessarily is what the advice of the expertise, right? I want them to do the things that are important to me. And because of that, there are no qualifications. So that is patronage, but also as president, right, we would agree that they were elected, which gives them a mandate to the public, and therefore they should be in charge of these departments, and their points of contact should be loyal to them, right? So patronage is sort of problematic because it can be corrupt, but can also just be the results of an election, right? If you want an elected office, you would want to pick your own staff. You want people you can trust, right? And that's not necessarily corruption, that's just sort of the spoils of winning. The other part about party machines and this sort of process is this idea of soft money, right? Money contribute directly to parties, right? When you have a party money, it doesn't have to go to a candidate, which means it's not regulated by spending laws. If I donate to a candidate, there's a limit amount of money I can donate to that candidate by law. If I donate to a party, there is no limit to that party money, right? But I have to report that I donate to the party. We'll talk about super PACs later, right? I don't have to limit how much money I give to a party. If I donate to a super PAC, I don't even have to say where that money went. I can just say I donated, and that super PAC doesn't have to say where it got the money from, right? So levels of clarity, right? A limited amount, and you have to report that you donated to a candidate. When it comes to the party, an unlimited amount, right? But you don't have to, an unlimited amount, but you still have to say that you put in that money. And then a super PAC, an unlimited amount, and you don't have to say where that money came from, right? And all of those issues, right, provide certain opportunities. So now you have a party, it's got a platform, it's got all these rules, right? You have these leadership, right? The leadership can become corrupt in the party machine. So how, if we have a party, do we have new policies? And new policies are brought about by a policy entrepreneur, right? And this individual is usually a party leader or voters, right? Voters often pick a new policy. We'll talk about that in Nevada, right? New policy comes through initiative most of the time in Nevada, not through leaders. But when you have a new individual, and I'm going to use the example of AOC or Ocasio-Cortez, right? The elected official, Democratic elected official. This individual is not a party leader, but clearly, right, has a lot of new policies they would like to bring in, right? They're also sort of Sanders, AOC connection, right? That they're sort of tied together, but AOC is new. She brought in these new policy ideas. She has this energy, right, to bring in these policy ideas. Where you get to that is not the point. The point is she represents a policy entrepreneur, right? She is trying to bring attention to new problems, right? She is saying that they are political issues, right? Talk about college tuition, right? Those something that all of you care about, right? College tuition is an issue in society. I want to bring attention to it. I say it's a political issue because the United States government passed a law that says the government is a direct lender. So we're the lenders to these students. The tuition is getting higher. Therefore, it's a political issue. And here is a policy proposal to fix this issue that I have identified, whether it be lower tuition or more forgiveness or any other factor. All of those things seem to matter for this aspect. Okay. In Congress, you have two parties, right? We are a two-party system. You have a majority party and a minority party. When we talk about this, right, we've also talked about a majority leader, right? The offices, right? The majority leader in the Senate has all the power, right? For those of you who saw this question, we're like, okay, what happened? The president of the Senate is actually the vice president in the federal government, right? And the vice president is the president of the Senate. But the only thing the president of the Senate can do in the Senate is vote for a tiebreaker, right? If there is a tie, then the vice president votes. So the president of the Senate doesn't have a lot of power. The person who has a lot of power is the majority leader. So if you're the majority party, right, you pick, right, the chairs of each committee that you can, right, if you're the majority party leader. The minority party still has a lot of power because they fill them, right? If there are 9 seats and you're the majority, right? Typically it's 5-4, some combination, right? Some mixed representation of parties. So because that mixed representation of parties works, right? The minority party still has power because they can change the outcome of those committees, but right, the majority party has overriding power, right? In cases where there's not clear consensus. Divided government is this idea where one branch is controlled by a party and the other branch of government is controlled or mixed between the other party. Divided government applies in part to this idea that if you have a president who's one party and all of Congress is that party, it's very efficient, right? We saw in 2008, right, the Democrats owned, right? Democrats had Congress and the presidency, and they passed the Affordable Care Act, right? In 2016, right, Republicans had the House and the Senate and the presidency, and so therefore they could pass as many bills as they could get through, right? Now we know the Affordable Care Act wasn't repealed, right? Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and John McCain, right, voted against it, and so the skinny bill didn't pass, and the Affordable Care Act still exists in part, right? For those of you who don't know, there's this sort of historical moment. Actually, you're probably young enough that you didn't work part of this, right? John McCain, right, who has passed away, right, who had a difficult relationship with the president, right? The president said he wasn't a war hero because he got captured. So John McCain is the 50th vote, right? Because Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, they had already said they weren't going to vote for the skinny bill. And so there were only going to be 50 votes. The Republican Party was only going to get 50 votes. The vice president was going to vote the tiebreaker, right? And John McCain is expected to say yes. He walks up to the speaker, to the microphone, he puts his hand up and he says no. And it's this big moment in society because he has always been sort of right, he's always been called a maverick. He's always sort of been an Arizona conservative, which has its own sort of conditions, right? Just like Nevadans are different, Arizonans are different. And so it becomes this moment for John McCain to sort of stand into his position. But, right, because of that, he's always going to, for the rest of his life, he was going to have a tenuous relationship with the president, which he already had a tenuous relationship. But that divided government pushes that even more, right? When it required that sort of historical moment for the party to not get what they want. When you have divided government, neither party gets what they want all the time. Because remember, a law has to pass in the House and the Senate. So even though the Democrats only control the House, right, it stops any laws from being passed. Anything that the Republican-controlled Senate wants, they can't get because the Democrats control the House. And so that's divided government, right? When you have universal government, you need some sort of historical moment or some unusual behavior by a candidate to not get your way as a party. When you have divided government, everything kind of creases to a halt. You don't have as many laws passed, and then you start to deal with deadlock or gridlock, right, where you don't have things passed. Okay. So when we're talking about party identification, party ID, right, this is an individual voter's psychological ties to one party or another. Party ID is not that they choose a party that's in their best interest. A lot of Republican voters, right, if they're partisan towards the Republican Party, they would be better off being Democrats, right, under their economic exchange, right? If you're a very poor person in the South, you would be better off voting for Democrats because they would push for services, and you need services because there's high unemployment, there's a lot of rural areas, right? There's a lack of infrastructure in those areas, right? So economically, you'd be better off. So it's not that you're better off with one party, it's that your psychological ties are with one party, right? Democrats as much as Republicans, but it's easier to point out the Lincoln Republicans, right? Republicans and religion have a much stronger tie, right? Democrats and religion, their tie isn't as clear. Republicans and religion, even though Democrats have their own ties, the causal link is clear. So I'm using it for explanatory purpose, not because Republicans are somehow different or worse or better or anything. You grew up in a church and the people in that church are Republican, right? And so in your mind, right, this happens to a number of voters, right? Me and my family, we go to church together. Church is the right thing. That's where you get your morality from. That's where I got my Republican values from, and therefore I am a Republican. It is a psychological tie, right? Your brain tells you that the value of the party is linked to other values in your life that don't have to be connected with real policy. And that's very important, right? Real policy does not have to be connected to your party ties. You can be, right, you can be Hispanic and your parents can be undocumented and you can still be a Republican, right? Even though it doesn't serve your interests to be a Republican, you can still have a psychological tie for any reason. Okay. So a party activist is just someone who contributes time, energy, and effort to support their party and its candidates. I'm like, because anyone can be a part of activist, this definition, that I'm not as concerned about what it means to be a party activist. I'm more concerned about what it means to be in a party, right? What's the difference between being a partisan and being in a party, right? Are you a partisan where you vote for the Republicans? Are you in the Republican Party where you're a delegate? Or are you in the Republican Party where you work for, right, someone who is, right, you're a right, office staff for a Republican Party member, right? Are you in the Republican Party? Only because none of you are really old enough to be in the Republican Party sort of main decision-making process, unless some of you are very wealthy or have good connections, which you would probably not end up at UNLV. In the 20th century, sort of going from the 1960s to the 1990s. So in the 1960s to the 1990s, in the 1960s, the parties are really close. And we have sort of a switch, right? Before like the values were not as separate, right? The Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they weren't that different. So attachment to either party was quite low, right? There weren't as many partisans. And so what happens is the Republicans and the Democrats realize that the strategy they've been using to try and be as moderate as possible, right? Both parties, right, if I use the description, they both wanted to be in the middle. And so, I need to be able to see this so I can. So you have both parties here, and I know it's sort of blocking so you can't see. So both parties, right, are here where my thumb's at. And they want to get voters. And what happens is the voters can sort of be in this side for liberals, and they can be in this side for Republicans, right? Democrats, Republicans. But because they're both in the middle, right? Both parties are in the middle. Voters stop really seeing as much of a difference, right? You can see a difference here if this is where the parties are. You can see a difference here or here. But if the parties start to get closer and closer, then what's the difference between those parties, right? If they start to get really overlined or lapping, it's not clear. And so then you're like, okay, am I a Democrat? Am I a Republican, right? What is my partisanship? What is my partisanship for this issue? And your partisanship changes because they're overlapping in the 1960s and the 1970s. And parties realize this. So what they start to do, and what voters start to do, is start to move farther out, right? Today's conservatives are farther right than 1960s and 1970s conservatives. Now the values have changed, right? The policy issues have changed, right? The entire country has moved a little bit more to the left, right? There's more of a consensus about sort of certain issues, right? We talked about same-sex marriage. It used to be a really hot button issue, right? It's sort of resolved in the courts. And if we look at, right, the Supreme Court justice is up for, is in the Senate hearings this week, right? They're not asking her about same-sex marriage. They're asking her about Roe v. Wade, right? They're asking her about different things. So some of the issues aren't the same, right? We are a little more left than previous generations when it comes to racial tolerance, when it comes to, right, acceptance of same-sex couples, right? So because society has moved and because the courts have already decided, there's no concern about that. And because constitutionally, it's very clear that you shouldn't, like, the Constitution is very clear about discrimination for same-sex couples, right? You can't discriminate based on the sex of the. No, you can discriminate based on sex, but the law is clear enough that you can't discriminate based on whether or not it's a same-sex couple or a different sex couple, opposite-sex couple. So because of that, that's sort of resolved, right? But the parties start saying, well, we need to be able to get voters. It's no longer about being in the middle, and there's, right, not everyone is voting. So instead of being in the middle, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my party to the right. And yes, these voters here, right, they're not going to get. They may not vote for a Republican Party, but these people farther right, they're going to vote. That's what matters, right? It is not a matter of being in the right position anymore for the parties. It's about getting people to vote. You have to get them excited. 60% of eligible voters voted in 2018, I want to say, right? I want to say 2018, it might be 2016, right? But that means 40% of the people who could vote didn't. That means that group could decide any single election, right? That's enough voters that if you get your base, right, we think they're about roughly, they're not, no place has more than like 65, 70%, right, of the unvoters, right? The people who didn't vote, they're still broken out about 50-50 Democrats, Republicans in different areas, right? So it's not about how do I get to the middle anymore. Now it's about how do I excite my voters to get them to go out and vote, right? If I could convince all of the young people in Nevada to vote, I could determine the outcome of the election. Because so many young people vote Democrat, that if I could just get 18 to 25-year-olds to vote, they would definitely skew the election and the Democrat would win in Nevada. All the Democrats would win, right? Because they're just going to vote Democrat. They're not going to look up and research every candidate. They're going to say, oh, I'm just vote for the Democrats because they know the Democrats are better than the Republicans for a young person, right? It's typical of young people to be Democrats, right? And that's not your generation thing. That's just young people typically skew Democratic and older people skew Republican. That's just a aspect we talked about, right? Conservatives are status quo defenders, right? If you spent your whole life developing the status quo, you want to defend it when you're older, which sort of makes you be Republican near the end of your life. All right. So now we talked about, right, they had this de-alignment where people weren't partisan, and then you had this sort of realignment, right, because of this polarization. So what happens, why do the parties say we should just pick up the polarization to pick up voters, is because we know about historical realignment. So in the very beginning of the US, right, I'm going to go through a quick history, and we won't spend a lot of time on this one because I'm running out of breath, and two because, right, I want to finish this because I thought it wouldn't take as long, but apparently it will. The start of the country, you have the founders, some of the founders, and the president, right, George Washington, saying that we shouldn't have parties at all, right? He warns against parties, but he uses the language of factions. So you shouldn't have factions, right? Factions are bad. We should always just vote on the candidates, right? We should always just say, here are the candidates up for election, and we should vote based on their principles and their policies, right? Well, we know that's not going to work because people don't want to get informed as much about it. It's much harder. There's a lot more information out there and entertainment, right? When Washington ran for president, when he became president, he didn't really run in the same way, right? Because everyone wanted him to be president, or the majority of people wanted him to be president when he was nominated. Is that you have all this other information, all these things taking up your time. You're not going to do the research, and right until about the 1920s, before the sort of radio becomes popular, you would read everything that you got if you could read, because there was so little entertainment, so little going out, that everyone read the paper every day and they would always be more informed about the candidates, right? So what happens is the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, we talked about this, it's not important, and it's very good, I'm just giving you history so we can get to the point of sort of modern day. But the Federalists sort of went out, so the Anti-Federalists drop off. Then you have a presidency, and then when Jefferson runs for president, he sort of forms his Republican Party. They're Jeffersonian Republicans. And these are not the Republican Party of Lincoln, right? This is just Jeffersonian Republicans. And so he forms a party and a cohesive set of ideas, and this is the first time a party really comes about. Then between Jefferson and the Civil War, you have the Democrats come about and the Whigs come about, right? You have the Republicans and the Whigs die off, or the Whigs stop winning elections, and the Democrats take their place. The Democrats are pro-slavery until the Civil War, right? So you have Democrats that are typically pro-slavery in the beginning of the 19th century, right? And Republicans who are abolitionists, right? Remember, it's historically accurate to say Republicans are the party of Lincoln, right? So Lincoln's party becomes the Republican Party. They're abolitionists, right? They want to sort of make sure secure rights, right? Remember, the 14th Amendment comes about because of the Civil War, right? That the Bill of Rights apply to all citizens. So the Republican Party is doing very well, but the reason why the Democrats sort of drop off is because they secede. Right, they quite literally leave the Union, right? And this, you know, this history of the Civil War, you should, right? So the Republicans dominate everything because during the Civil War, they're the only party that exists. Anyone who's a Democrat has left, right? So the Republicans dominate for a while. And then when you have the Democrats come back in after the Civil War, because there's such an adjustment, what happens is the Democrats, right, in 1865, right, don't have as much power as the Republicans, because while the Democrats were gone, the Republicans structured the government to work for them, right? And this is the party of Lincoln Republicans. So then you have Democrats sort of working with Republicans. You sort of have this balance, Republicans and Democrats sort of breaking free. And so 1860 to 1929, Democrats and Republicans are working together. And so then what happens is in 1929, right, You have the Great Depression, we talked about this, the New Deal Democrats. The New Deal Democrats take over and they start winning everywhere, right? FDR's Democrats win offices everywhere. And Republicans start to fall apart, right? They might win a presidential election, right, if FDR ever leaves, right? But they're not going to win enough congressional elections. And so what happens is over time, the Democrats become socially liberal and fiscally liberal, right? The Democrats are going to be spending on projects. They're going to be, right, raising taxes, right? They will raise taxes because they're trying to spend on products, but they're also going to go after making sure things are more equivalent, right? They start including more things into the 14th Amendment, so more people get more rights during this New Deal time. And so what happens is between 1860, with Lincoln as the president of Republicans, and in 1960, when you start seeing this shift, is that Republicans and Democrats stop being aligned. Because Republicans want services and goods for their people, and they want, right? You still have abolitionists, reformer abolitionists, Republican aspects of the Republican Party, and the Democrats want services for their people. Well, there's not a lot of difference between them. So what happens is the Republicans pick up this thing called the Southern Strategy. And the Republicans decide about the Southern Strategy is that there are a lot of Dixiecrats, right? These are Southern Democrats. So Southern Democrats are called Dixiecrats in that time period. Not anymore, just during that time period. And the problem with that is part of the Democratic Party is Northerners who believe in social inclusion and projects. And then part of the Democratic Party is Southerners. And these are former Democrats who left the Union, right? The Dixiecrats of the 1950s and 1960s believe in segregation, right? They want segregation. They believe in pro-life. They believe in banning abortion. They have very, very different values than the other part of their party. So the Democratic Party is not cohesive in its values. So what happens is the Republican Party, in order to win Congress and the House, decides to pick up the Dixiecrats. It shifts into a pro-life party. It shifts into a more religious party in the 1960s and 1970s. It starts embracing segregation, right, and racial differences. And so the Republican Party in the 60s and 70s becomes the party that's on the right that we know today. And the Democrat Party, as a response, becomes left, right? Remember, it's two parties. So if I say I'm on the right, you have to say you're on the left, right? If I pick up one position, you take up the opposite, right? If we only have two parties, anytime a Republican Party says they want one thing, the Democratic Party picks up the opposite. That's basic, right, politics, right? That if you want to win elections, right, the Republicans are on one side, the Democrats on the other, because that's going to help get people to vote, right? Remember, it's not about being in the right position, it's that you need to get people to vote. And so therefore, if you're for a policy that the Republicans put up, you might vote for it, but if you're against it, right, the Democrats being against it will help them get votes as well, right? So that's an entire policy that exists. Okay. So the next part about that, right, is that as you go into contemporary politics, it's no longer de-aligned. That polarization is high now, right? Now it's very clear who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, and what are their values. We have a consolidation among the parties because everyone knows where they stand. And therefore, because everyone knows what party they're in, you no longer have to moderate at all. The strategy of today is to anger or empower your base. Right? Why does Trump behave the way that he does? It would seem like if you're like, well, he's not appealing to moderates. He's not trying to appeal to moderates. Bush wasn't trying to appeal to moderates. They're appealing to their base. They need more of their base to vote. No one's changing any minds, right? The reason why it works for Republicans a little better is because Republican partisans are typically older and they're more likely to vote, right? You can engage them, you can mobilize, right? You can mobilize them into voting, right? I can upset the people or I can encourage the people in my party as a Republican, and they're already more likely to vote. Whereas if you're a Democrat, right, they want to mobilize you, right? Democratic Party really wants you to mobilize. Biden really needs young voters to come out because it's the only way he's going to win certain states, right? He cannot win Nevada or Pennsylvania without young voters or Ohio without young voters. So he wants to mobilize you, but you're still young, which means that you're less likely to vote as an aspect of your youth, right? Just that as you get older, right, you'll be more likely to vote, right? Not a judgment, just that it happens in everyone's life, right? So they're both trying to do that. So now, why don't we just, I think that's the last slide. Okay, good. So we're on the last slide about third parties, and this is a good thing to end with because it's going to take a minute to explain this. There's two parties, right? Whichever party gets the most votes, because we're a plurality, so you just have to get the most votes, right? If there's only two people, right? If there's only two people running, if I'm running and someone else is running, and they get 3 votes and I get 2 votes, and there were, right, 100 possible votes, that person still wins with 3 votes, right? We talked about the Simpson case, right? Milhouse runs for an election, Bart is the more popular. Milton wins, the nerd wins, because he's the only one who voted. He got 1 vote, right? Plurality, you just have to have the most votes. So why not pick up a third party and just take as many votes? Well, a couple of things, right? Third parties can be very useful, but, right, not to win elections, but to bring attention to issues, right? The Green Party is often co-opted by the Democrats. So if you want Green Party policies, why not vote for a Green Party and get them elected? The first aspect that is strategic voting, right? We know that most votes are aligned into 2 parties. So if there is 2 parties and they're taking up most of the vote and you're taking up that little space that exists, right, then you won't win an election, right? Strategic voting is that your candidate's not going to win, right? I want to, it's in the next slide, but I can't remember the names, right? So in the last election, the 2016 election, there was a Green Party candidate, there was a Libertarian candidate, and in Utah, right, very sort of, Utah started doing this, they voted for their own candidate. They voted for a Utah candidate, right? So the Utah candidate won, and neither the Republican or the Democrats got that state, right? But the problem with that is that that individual had no chance of winning, right? The Libertarian candidate had almost no chance of winning. The Green Party candidate actually had no chance of winning because they weren't running enough states. If they won, even if the Green Party won every state they were running in, they would have still only had 250 so odd electoral college votes. They could not win the election, right? So if you know those can't win, every time you vote for that party, you're putting your principles first, right? It's a principle vote. This is the vote that aligns with my principles. But the outcome may not fit with you, right? If you're a Green Party, if you believe in the Green Party, right, you might vote with the Green Party, but that's one less vote for the Democratic Party, right? For the Democratic candidate, right? Because the Green Party and the Democrats are very closely aligned, right? If you're in the Green Party, you're not going to vote Republican, right? But that means you didn't vote for the Democrat, which means that's one less vote for the Democrat, which even though it doesn't change the Republican vote, it lowers the Democratic vote. And so by voting for a third party, you're actually helping the party that maybe you don't align with win. And so this is called strategic voting. Right? It's not what's my best choice, it's what's my best viable alternative. And in the United States, there are only 2 viable alternatives in most elections, right? A third party will not win this election, right? It will either be Biden or Trump. So if you vote for a third party, what happens is whatever party, right, say you were a Green Party voter and you vote Green Party, that's one less vote for Biden, which means the likelihood of Trump winning goes up. So strategic voting is why voters in the United States don't vote for third parties. They don't want their opposition to win. It's more important for them to get the second choice for most voters than to vote their principles, right? And principle voting is very problematic, right? Because in the long run, you don't get your principles, right? You don't get the things you really want because your party doesn't win. And it ends up that your vote doesn't count, which means your opposition is more likely to win. Despite that, it has happened in the past, right? The Republican Party replaced the Whigs. The Whigs had some older, sort of more dated policies. They weren't really adapting to the new culture, right? And this is like early 19th century, right? This is sort of 1820s. They are not adapting to the new culture, the new policy environment. They're not adapting to new issues, right? And so the Republican Party wins those seats as a third party. It is possible for a third party to replace a party, but there has to be a significant shift, right? It is possible, right, that because the Republican Party is no longer neoconservatives, but sort of more farther right under the presidency, right? The party aligns with the president, right? The president never aligns with the party. The party goes with the president. So Trump has realigned the party to him and his views, right? And so it's possible that a more moderate Republican Party with a new name might slip in there and sort of push that party out, right? It's possible. On the left, we're having a lot of Democratic socialists. We're having, right, the AOC and Bernie Sanders, they're Democratic socialists. They believe in a lot of free college and a lot of different issues that are very different from a moderate Democrat, right? Obviously, Biden and AOC and Sanders don't agree on issues. And you have sort of the Green Party talking about climate change over here, right? The sort of the Greta Thunbergs that are sort of up and coming and will eventually hold political office, right? So when you have that group, they might replace because each party is either going too far to the extreme or they're becoming too moderate, right? So it's possible, it's just highly unlikely because of strategic voting. The other part that limits third parties is this idea of co-option and policy adoption. So the Green Party started to really kill the Democrats in the last 50 years because of one thing, climate change, right? Democrats believe in climate change. Climate change is damaging to the environment. Damage to the environment is problematic for future generations, right? The Green Party knew this, right? Because we all knew this. Science was very clear in the 80s and 90s, right? It's always been clear about climate change. So voters start moving in that direction, saying, well, we need to do something about climate change. But the party platform changes every time we have an election. So the Democratic Party platform changes to adapt to the new policy concerns. And because, right, the Democratic Party has embraced climate change, they've pulled in all those Green Party voters. And usually that's what happens, right? A third party tries to bring attention to an issue in the same way that a policy entrepreneur would bring attention to an issue. And then one of those parties adopts that other group, right? And so that's a process by which third parties are sort of collected rather than replacement. And so third party voting is highly unlikely, and therefore third parties typically collapse, right? Now, there will always be some third parties because there's always some issue that people feel aren't being respected, right? Libertarians and Green Party will always be there. The United States doesn't have a communist party, but that has to do with McCarthyism, which we'll talk about later, right? There are reasons why we don't have a communist party, but most states have some sort of pseudo-communist party, which is about sort of free care, free life, right? And we saw, right, even if there was sort of more socialist or communist arguments, we saw an argument by Yang, a Democratic candidate, about universal income, right? Everyone should have $1,000 a month to spend, right? As we move forward, if that becomes more and more popular, you will see the Democratic Party co-opt that rather than let another party grow, right? Because remember, the party's ultimate goal is to win elections. And they will change their party, their policy, their values to fit with what wins them elections, right? That's why the Republican Party, right, at some point they're both sort of aligned in protecting rights, right, and sort of limiting discrimination. And then, right, in the 60s and 70s, the Republican Party moves right. In fact, the Democratic Party doesn't move that much, right, except you have these Dixiecrats, which are very, right, you have these Dixiecrats over here, which are sort of for racial segregation, right? And then the Republican Party co-opts them and moves over here, right? And so that's why, even though the Republicans are the party of Lincoln, right, why that argument's a little swayed is because that's the realignment that they had in the 60s and 70s, right? And that was to pick up those voters. All right, if there are no questions, I appreciate you dealing with the live stream. I know this has been kind of a headache. So if you have any questions, remember that the paper's coming up. The prompt is already on Web Campus. I posted, and it should be published, the assignment. So distracted. So it's up, right? It's due Thursday at midnight. Make sure you do that assignment. The other thing, okay, I knew I was going to talk about it. Sorry about this. The assignments are due by a certain date. Those due dates for assignments should be a suggestion to keep you on track, right? Why was assignment 4 due before the exam or during the day of the exam? Because I want you to take it before the exam to be prepared. But I didn't remove the assignments. So if you missed an assignment, go back and do it. And it on my grade book, like the thing is in my grade book, it's like pink, right? Instead of being the normal, it's pink on the thing to be like, oh, this is late. 4 assignments, I don't care. I don't care if you do them at the end of the semester. I don't care if you do them now, just do them, right? Those are assignments, just consider it like the paper and the work. Do all of that, right, before the paper is due. Because after that, a lot of you will know your exact grade in the class and will move forward. So just be prepared for that as moving forward. And I think that's it for today. I'm going to work on sort of making sure I moderate the comments a little better, but hopefully this is not a continuing issue. So thank you. Have a good day, and I will see you Thursday.